Great. Well, welcome everyone. Glad y'all are sticking with us through our Great is Thy Faithfulness Bible study series on God's covenants. This week is the Mosaic covenant. We have done the covenant of creation with Barbara Tito, covenant of Noah, and covenant of Abraham. We appreciate Natalie doing that. And this week we're going to do Exodus 20 verses, actually 1 through 20 we'll be looking at primarily. But this is when when Moses receives, or the people of Israel receive the law from God. The thing about this text actually is the covenant of Moses is extremely long because it goes really from chapters 19 to 24. And where is my lesson? There is my lesson plan. So we will really kind of be looking briefly at I'll just summarize a little bit of 19. We'll look at the text of 20. 21 through 23 is a lot of details. We'll be kind of glancing over that. And if we have time, we'll look at chapter 24 as well. The really big thing we want to see is we've talked a lot about the model of covenants, and the Mosaic covenant, or the covenant with Israel, is really modeled off after the treaties of ancient empires that really were sort of larger imperial powers with their vassal or subjected people. These are like the Hittites, who were from Turkey, and then also the Assyrians in the sort of 8th and 7th centuries. And in the heart of these treaties, like with the law, as we'll see here, are stipulations, the laws. And the kind of deal, like any law, is if you abide by these, all would be well, but if not, dire consequences would follow. So in the treaties, there would be curses and blessings, and not so much like magical curses, but if you do this, this will happen. But if you do this well, this you will be rewarded. And these curses were really prominent, mainly with the Assyrian treaties. The Hittite treaties were typically had a unique aspect, which were the historical prologues. And this sort of recounted the courses of events that led up to the treaty. That was either great battles and power. This would create fear of the might, sort of demonstrated by the history of the Hittite armies, or gratitude for their willingness, or to inspire gratitude for the willingness to make a treaty at all, or instead of just destroying them. So most of the elements of these treaties can be found in the Bible, and especially in Deuteronomy, when we see the repetition of the covenant in Deuteronomy. But here in Exodus 26, we actually have it, or Exodus 26, excuse me, Exodus 20, we do have elements of each, but sometimes they're a little unique, and we'll talk about that. I think it helps kind of give interest to the text, and not just in its pure sort of militaristic form or political form. Hey, Kent, how are you?
I'm good.
Welcome. So in the there's three forms in the whole subject matter of the covenant with Israel. Exodus 19 is sort of the theophany. It's the setting up the scene. It's the appearance of God, and it is quite a scene. I really like it. It's definitely something we'll talk a little bit about in detail, but definitely take some time to read that. It helps set up the understanding of just the 10 Commandments, or watch Charlton Heston, one of the two. And then Exodus 20 is the Decalogue, the covenants, really verses 1 through 20, and the rest of Exodus 20, and then 21 to 23, those are really, there's the covenant, or the commandments, and then there's the laws, or actually scholars call chapters 21 to 23 the book of covenants, which are much more sort of have a sort of an exchange, like you won't do this or this will happen. So it's a little confusing when we were talking about the larger covenant, but then there's the book of covenants. And what we're studying is not the book of covenants. So, just making it really simple for everyone this evening. And then chapter 24 is sort of a sign or a seal of the covenant. This is, and really kind of the first time we've seen this, as we talked with Noah and Abraham, is this we actually see people responding and accepting the terms of their agreement. So they didn't just check the box. Great job. Anyways, so setting the stage, in chapter 19, the Israelites have just left Egypt and they're entering the wilderness of Sinai. And they're camped in front of the mountain. And Moses goes up to the mountain because God has called him. And the Lord speaks in chapters 19, verse 30 to 6. And God says to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the house of Jacob and tell the Israelites, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the Israelites." And so then Moses goes back down the mountain. You'll see in 19, Moses is up and down the mountain. One scholar was like, he's an extremely fit old man. So Moses then gathers all the people and shares these words with God. And here their response is in 19 verses 8. It says, "The people all answered as one, everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do." And we will see that responsive response, that collective response throughout sort of all these chapters in this section of Exodus. The important thing here is, even before we kind of see other aspects that I think a lot of times we focus more on with the covenant with Moses and Israel, is that this is a collective response. This is a covenant really made with a community. I think that's one of the unique aspects of this. We've seen it with Noah. It was, kind of a promise to creation. And then with Abraham, it was promised to Abraham, and implicitly it's his family and a blessing of a great nation. But here, this is to all, like the collective. This is a covenant with a large group of people. And what I like is some of the words that stood out to me in this is that you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Penn on Sunday talked a lot about how we are selected in the covenant of Abraham. We are selected, we are set apart. But here, I really like the idea of possession. Generally, when we talk about, especially in this day and age, when we talk about possession of people, it's a negative term. But here we are claimed and we belong to God. So there's that sense of belonging in more of a familial way that I really like. So I don't know, that's just one sort of the unique word, I thought, the possession out of all the peoples, that stood out to me. So anyways, as we said, this is sort of a promise with the response from the community, because it's a covenant with community, not just with one person. And then Moses goes back to the Lord and says that, goes back to God up the mountain, and God then sort of promises that he will appear as a dense cloud so that people can hear and see when he speaks to Moses. And this will provide some credibility to Moses yet again. So this proves that God is with the Israelites and gives credibility and authority to Moses. So that's all the sort of preemptive events of when they are setting up the scene for this. So then we have a description of the people being consecrated. And this is when people are supposed to cleanse themselves, wash their clothes, because on the third day, numbers throughout the Old Testament are always significant. And we see some of the repetitions of numbers that we see in the New Testament, especially around Jesus, here as well. We'll see 40 days and 40 nights, with the wilderness, but also when Jesus was tempted, and then also, when Moses goes up the mountain a final time, he goes up for 40 days and 40 nights. And we also have that for Noah. Anyways, the people are to cleanse themselves, and on the third day, Lord, I was going to say Jesus appears, y'all. No. The Lord comes down to the top of Mount Sinai. They keep saying he descended, but he doesn't come to the ground. He descends to the mountains in the sight of all the people, and he's appearing as a great cloud. And a rule has gone out that no people can touch the mountain or go up the mountain, or they will be struck dead, or they will be stoned or shot with arrows. And this is emphasizing that God will not tolerate contact from anything that is impure, or not even animals. There's a stipulation that says if some sort of animal touches the mountain, they're supposed to be killed as well, which I think is an interesting contrast to, especially when we talk about the covenant of Jesus Christ, is so much of God's or Christ's ministry and emphasis when he is here on earth is about touch and proximity. Is there's a lot of proximity, especially for Moses, to God, but not for the people. And in contrast, we have sort of I think that's one aspect we can explore when we look at that covenant, is the fact that touch and, Jesus is always trying to get away from the crowds because the crowds are so close to him, and then also in his miracles of healing. So just an interesting point to think about. Then on the third day, there was a thunder and lightning and thick cloud on the mountains. God is this cloud. We see that repetition throughout the Exodus, with God represented as a cloud. And this is the appearance of God, and God is sort of a warrior. And then a trumpet sounds that causes everyone to tremble. And the interesting thing for me is that the idea of a trumpet is really sort of the traditional sign of a start of war. We also think of the trumpets or the horns of Jericho. And so here is the scene where the trumpet is getting louder and Moses is speaking, and then God is answering in thunder. And so everyone is trembling, the Israelites. I mean, it's kind of a frightening idea. And then Moses goes up the mountain again, and God then, which is a change, it's interesting, is earlier God says that when the trumpet sounds, this is a sign you can allow people up the mountain. But now God is saying that people cannot come up, but bring Aaron with you. So that's a lot. And then we enter into chapter 20 with the 10 Commandments. These are, we call it the Decalogue, the 10 rules, or literally the 10 words. So any questions sort of about setting us up for the people are preparing themselves, God is preparing them, with Exodus 19. Okay. Well, I will move quicker because I did not.
Well, I could say something.
Yeah.
On mute. I kind of noticed throughout the chapter, just kind of skimming along, it still is always a God-initiated thing that the Lord called to Moses, and I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself, was what he did for the nation, all the way down to the end when he's saying the last trumpet sounds, and the Lord descended to the top of Mount Sinai and called Moses to the top of the mountain. But it's always the Lord calling. It's not Moses going up and begging for something exactly. I just found that a nice observation.
Yeah, I think that's really important, because there is that continuity that God is bestowing this like God has done in the previous contents. And that's interesting that I think when we look at the wording of the 10 Commandments, that will come into play, because this is definitely, I think, God lowering God's self to us. And then we'll see the first time when we have to actually do stuff ourselves. Thank you, Reg. Okie dokie. I vote, because we all remember our good Sunday school lessons and we all memorize the Westminster Catechism. Let's actually look at chapter 20, verses 1 through 12, 20, I did 20. And I have it so that if someone would read the first slide, not this one, and then I'm sorry, let me trying to get everything away. So I'm going to read the first slide and then we'll have a second slide. Anyone can jump in.
I can read that.
Right.
Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in the heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or worship them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work, you, your son or your daughter, your male or female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it.
Thank you, Barb. You can either continue or if someone else would like to read.
Someone else is fine.
Paige, I know you're a wonderful out loud reader. All this.
Yeah, well, first I have to figure out how to unmute it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or male or female slave, or ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. When all the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the sound of the trumpet, and the mountain smoking, they were afraid and trembled and stood at a distance and said to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, or we will die." Moses said to the people, "Do not be afraid, for God has come only to test you and to put the fear of him upon you, so that you do not sin."
Thank you. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks.
Thanks be to God.
Thanks be to God.
I love that line. Do not be afraid. He has only come to put fear upon you. What a lovely, we understand there's a difference in that sort of fear, but I thought it was funny. Also, I've realized never ask someone to read when your first line says, then God spoke all of these words. You realize you're in it for a while, but thank you, Barb and Paige. So in Exodus 20, last week I talked a little bit about the week before last when we were discussing Noah, talked a little bit about the J or the Yahwehist source and then the priestly source. We actually, for Exodus 20, we really get a third source, which is called you'll see it written as the E or the Elohist source. It's Elohim. This is really when we see that God is called Elohim in the Hebrew. And some of its characteristics, just quickly, is they use the name Jacob instead of Israel. I think we saw this in there. Jethro, who is Moses' father-in-law, they use his name instead of Ruel. And then sometimes Mount Sinai is called Horeb instead of Sinai. And so these are just sort of some markers, but what we know is from source criticism is that Exodus 20 really comes from this source, and that makes it somewhat unique. And generally the Elohist source is used to enhance or revive passages of the J source. And then we kind of see this explains the differences when we see the Ten Commandments either completely repeated, like in Deuteronomy 5, with adjustments, or when times the commandments are repeated, but they're not really the same. Some are included, some are not. So just wanted to talk a little bit about this. The big thing is about sort of the commandments is the way we distinguish them. In the Jewish tradition, they really distinguish between, it's 5 and 5. There's 5 positive ones, sort of you will honor your parents, and 5 negative, you will not bear false witness. In the Christian tradition, we really sort of divide them up more like there's the obligations to God and obligations to neighbor. And in some traditions, sort of like the Catholic, the Anglican, and the Lutheran tradition, the obligations to God are just counted as 3. The prohibition of idolatry is sort of kind of put under the first commandment, but a distinction for them is made between coveting one's neighbor's wife and coveting property, which I think is nice, because unfortunately the wife and property oftentimes get lumped together. In our tradition, which scholars prefer, so I always like hearing that, is we have the commandments are divided into 4 and 6. 4 obligations to God and 6 to our neighbor. The idolatry is dealt with separately, and but prohibition of coveting whatever is listed is considered one. Does that make sense? I don't know if I worded that correctly. I had to make sure I was checking my notes on that one. So this sort of division seems the most, with the 4 and 6, seems to be the most in line with the way the original text works. So that's why scholars kind of prefer the Reformed division. The first 4 commandments, they deal with Israel's obligations to God. The first forbids any worship of any other gods, and yet scholars like to distinguish that this is not really monotheism, because they do sort of assert that the other gods exist, but the only true God is our God, and they're not allowed to make oaths or covenants in the name of other gods. So that's just one distinction, is that the restriction to worship was only to one God, and this was exceptional kind of in that ancient world. The Second Man Commandment, I'm just doing these really quickly so that we have time to talk. I realize I'm talking a lot today. The Second Commandment complements the first one, since images were often essential in pagan worship. And that later gets expanded, sort of the representation of God, especially in the Jewish culture, not so much for us, but about banning even depictions of our God. So Exodus 25:6 reinforces this images. For I, the Lord, am a jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents, to the 3rd and 4th generation of those who reject me, by showing steadfast love to the 1,000th generation for those who love and keep my commandments. The jealousy of Yahweh is recurring throughout Hebrew, the Hebrew Bible, and the idea that God might punish children for the sins of the parents would actually be later questioned. So we can talk about that later. The 3rd commandment is prohibiting the wrong use of Yahweh's name, and this is really sort of frivolous oaths. I think they're thinking of like sort of pagan testimonies, which was probably prevalent in this society, and it was considered an affront to deities. We say, taking the Lord's name in vain with cussing or curses. This did not originally outlaw the use of God's name in non-liturgical usages, but a lot of times it has not been expanded to that in the Hebrew culture, and then also ours. The 4th commandment that observes the Sabbath day, this is Sabbath comes from Shabbat, which means to rest, and the week, this would be a distinctive characteristic of Judaism, and actually caused some mockery, and it was seen as a sign of laziness, but we don't really know where the custom of this came from, sort of where they observed it. But the observance of the Sabbath is sort of, we think, is really kind of influenced from the priestly source, and links its account to Genesis 1. Sabbath is sort of Sabbath keeping is creation keeping. There's been a lot of ties on that. The Bible Project actually did a really good job about kind of linking this idea of Sabbath recently. In the past couple of weeks, it would be on their website, and does a beautiful job of linking creation with Sabbath. But it also helps preserve the community, because Sabbath is sort of part of natural law almost. There's later scholars sort of talk about the use of the Decalogue, and part of it is natural law, is they've kind of related to that. But everyone is entitled to Sabbath. It's one of their rights, and it crosses different boundaries that any society creates, and it all gives people peace, is sort of the big emphasis on that. And the remaining commandments concern relations in human culture and society. We all have laws that govern sort of some of these matters. So this is where the Bible is distinctive in the fact that it's solemnity in which these are proclaimed. So they're not just sort of laws, but they're commands. Honor thy father and thy mother. This was a staple element of Near Eastern wisdom literature, and it can be seen also in Proverbs and some of the books of the Bible that didn't make it into our canon. You shall not kill is not always the best translation. It really should be, you should not kill unintentionally or kill intended. Honestly, it's murder, because we will see that God has orders killings sometimes in the Old Testament, or allows killings. So really this one is do not murder. The effect is really not to prevent all killing, but to regulate the taking of life and make it a subject of community control. But it also ultimately points to the fact that all life belongs to God. The prohibition of adultery is concerned with the violations of marriage. It doesn't specifically encompass other issues of fornication, and is distinguished from elsewhere in biblical law, because that does help kind of itemize those sins. But we have to keep in mind that polygamy was permitted in ancient Israel. Abraham had 2 wives. Solomon had a whole lot of wives. As we will look at next week, David did whatever he wanted in the name of the law. But either men and women could be guilty of adultery. The difference is, how they were prosecuted and to what extent. But anyways, in the modern text, we really can take this and to see that this is applied in a fact that issues of sexuality are not really a casual matter, but healthy relationships in that way are sort of help promote a good order of God's world. And it shows a concern for healthy relationships that are full of respect, honor, and integrity. I think we sometimes simplify this, but it can be really amplified. The commandment of stealing, again, is in a larger context. We think about that God has given us work. God has given us gifts to accomplish this work, so that when people are stealing, they're stealing against our work, this calling that God has given us. And so then the thief violates sort of this blessing, this charge, this calling from God, if we want to think about it. And I think it's a more poetic sense. Truth-telling, bearing false witness is really sort of one of the key elements of that. Is it's blocking people from justice in a criminal court. I mean, if we think of it in a court sense, of bearing false witness really is if you are falsely testifying against someone in any situation or lying, you are now preventing them from receiving the justice that is entitled to them. It's going back to an idea of natural law, that justice is one of their inalienable rights as God's chosen people, or as created in the image of God. And finally, the 10th commandment really kind of helps supplement the issues of adultery and theft by forbidding the coveting of others' goods. It's not the best worded when you include your house, your wife, your ox, and your donkey. That is some historical contextual issues that we do recognize. But it was regarded as coveting is regarded as shameful, and it's offense to God because it's primarily looked at as a property issue, but covetous nature really has a way of breeding discontent and leads to abuse and crime within society. So it is a source of disorder and trouble of interpersonal relationships. So that's why I think coveting, I really got to keep that N and the T separate. Coveting can be detrimental to society. So that's just sort of briefly highlighting some of these larger expanses of ideas, because I feel like sometimes with the 10 Commandments, we think of them literally, and also we get into, and we do not have time for it tonight or here, but it's a great question, is what do we do with the law when the law has been fulfilled? But that's a larger theological question that I'll have someone with a dissertation to defend and explain. But what questions may have arisen or reactions to some of the things I said? I mean, because you can disagree.
I've got two things, one of which is I was reading recently Paul being accused of things, and I remember at Jesus's trial, the leaders of the faith they all had false witness against him, and there were no repercussions in either of those cases. Here you had the religiously pious who were in fact lying to achieve their own goals, and there were no repercussions other than maybe the best repercussion, which was, Paul and Jesus's lives were made more real and important as a result of their lying. The other observation I would make is coveting, in my opinion, is less about material goods or even status. It's kind of a self-eroding thing that makes you so dissatisfied with your own circumstances that you kind of get lost in a cesspool of, oh, woe is me, and everybody else has it better, and he's got a prettier wife, and he's got more ox than I do, he's got a better house, he's got a nicer Ferrari. I mean, where do you stop? I mean, how can you be totally satisfied if you're always thinking somebody's better than me, and I deserve it, or I want it?
Yes.
And I think the theological ramification of that is you've got God, so you're in pretty good shape. God's on your side, and a faithful person is going to realize that, even when times are meager and you don't have much stuff, if you're not coveting, I mean, look at harsh times in history when people thrived. I mean, I'm constantly reminded of people that survived concentration camps, because when they had a piece of bread, they'd break it into 6 pieces and share with the people around them. And the people that were stealing bread and hoarding it for themselves, and let it grow moldy, didn't do anybody any good. And those are the people that died quicker.
Hmm. And do y'all know the Examen is a Jesuit spiritual practice? It's a type of prayer. And, it's a specific liturgy, but you can kind of adapt it. And one of the things you do at the end of the day is look at your consolations and your desolations. And your desolations are what separate you from God. And you're supposed to kind of reflect on them and how to turn away from them. And I think, David, when you were talking about what coveting, not covenants, coveting means for you, that really, it is so much of what kind of distances us from God, especially in, I think, our society today, really falls under that coveting. It's all those distractions as well. Thank you.
Robert.
Yes.
So I might be getting a couple weeks ahead with this question. So you can say pause and answer it then. But in the Gospels, we hear about the account with Jesus and he's spending the day with the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and they try to trick him, and they ask him, which of the commandments is the greatest? And Jesus says, to love the Lord your God with all your heart. That's the greatest. And then the second greatest is to love your neighbor as yourself.
Right.
So is he just categorizing all the 10 commandments with the 4 and the 6? Or is Jesus, is he basically saying all the commandments are the greatest? Or is that, the part of Jesus where he comes to fulfill the law? I'd just be curious to know what you think about that.
That's a really good question. I haven't thought about it like that.
I don't know, when you were saying how you can categorize them as your duty to God and your duty to others, that made me immediately think of what Jesus says in the Gospels.
This is terrible. I would say, I'm kind of looking at it, is it a brand new commandment or is it just a summary? It's definitely a simplification, which I think is reflective of what God is doing in Christ in terms of sort of the extension of grace. And so here this is, because I think when we think about what is the greatest commandment, there's also all the laws that go within this as well. And so when you're fulfilling the law, it's not just the commandments, it's also the, do not boil a baby kid in its mother's milk. Some other, sorry, I was reading, that was the one that's very specific ones. So I think it summarizes, it's sort of one of those yes ands. I think it does summarize and kind of clearly defines really what the 10 commandments are pointing to, but it is actually doing something new, sort of with fulfilling the law and presenting us with the grace of Jesus Christ.
Hey, Bryce, I've always kind of thought of that as something that is a simplification and an expansion. It simplifies the 10 commandments into those two groups, but also expands them by saying, don't get caught up in the detail. If you're doing something that separates you from God, stop doing that. And if you're doing something that injures your neighbor, whether it's on this list or not, talking bad about your neighbor behind his back isn't necessarily lying. If you're telling the truth, it's not lying, but it's not helpful. It's not helpful to you. It's not helpful to your neighbor. So it's kind of this both simplification and expansion of the law, particularly, if you're a Pharisee and you're thinking, I got the law down pat, and I can check everything, and I can do stuff that's not included in the law, and I can follow the law to its T, but not the spirit of the law, and I'm okay. And this kind of wipes that out.
Yeah, the spirit of the law, and that's more than a few weeks ahead, right?
I think it's also interesting that when he quotes those two one of the greatest commandments, the Bible references some obscure places like in Leviticus where that is repeated. And so somehow he's pulling obscure stuff, not necessarily the 10 commandments, but he's summarizing it very well. But it's just interesting that those two pieces come out of just obscure places in the Old Testament, not out of the 10 commandments. For what it's worth.
Yeah. The kids call that a clap back.
I sometimes wonder if he sort of dumbed it down for the Sadducees too. He tended to get a little frustrated with them from time to time in the New Testament. He's like, you guys know the 10 commandments, the law. So here it is, a spoonful at a time, 2 of them.
Commandments for dummies.
Go with that.
You know the words, but you don't know what it means for sure.
lot of times when I'm reflecting on these, always thinking about how really they're trying to help us is what I think what God is doing. It's not just like saying, oh, you got to do this for me. You got to do this. You got to do this for me. That's what I want. It's saying, here's something for you, and this is going to make your life better. I'm going to focus on the Sabbath. I think all these things, but I think of, like you did, adultery is really about, value that relationship, and nurture that relationship, that special relationships, things like that. So it's for us. But on the Sabbath, I think it's kind of interesting. I'm kind of curious how different, you said that maybe it was, people were called lazy back in those days for having this, how different it was for the Jewish people as opposed to people around. But I think it's very notable in there that he says it's not just for you, it's for your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant, your animals, the aliens within your gates, everybody. It doesn't matter if they're an immigrant, if they're a slave, I think that is some others, it doesn't matter what it is, who they are, everybody gets to rest this day. And if you're thinking of this being to the people in power of the day, who is doing the most work? Well, probably the maidservants and the manservants and the cattle and all these things are doing all the work. And so it's I think there's a kind of sociological justice in this, saying everyone deserves rest. Everyone the same. The community you were talking about there is across the board, from the top of the social ladder to the very bottom.
Absolutely. God's peace is available to, these, like you were saying, the ones who are working the hardest, maybe the lower on the caste system, and then also the stranger in the city, the sort of the stranger among us, which I think is so important to remember, for sure. Anything else y'all want to? Rich, you also kind of talked a lot about, highlighted something I forgot to say, so thank you, is that this is sort of, while the Israelites are taking on sort of this responsibility and the importance of sort of mediating the law, they're not just doing it for themselves, which will set them apart and receive blessings as God is promised by God. But really what they're doing is, this is for the sake of the world. They are following God for, in response of Thanksgiving, but here they're even ordering society of some of these, keep saying natural law, or some of these basic rights for people that will provide for their own better living. Especially we have to remember they're like wandering, they're sort of nomadic people still at this time. But if they can do this, they will set up sort of this, we would now say sort of the kingdom of God on earth, but sort of life of the perfect tabernacle, sort of life under the law. Calvin, because it can't be Bible study at First Presbyterian without talking about John Calvin. Calvin that argues, he did a lot of work with the Decalogue, with the Ten Commandments, and he said that all of the commandments could be reversed. Really, specifically, he was talking about how the negative commandments could be constructed in a positive way. For example, like do not murder or do not kill could be, I think today we would always kind of put it in more of a positive spin of saying uphold or protect life. And when I hear that, I almost think, oh my gosh, that commandment means we need to make sure people are having food security, housing security, what enables them to live life, not just, okay, I won't kill someone, thinking of it in that light. Do you all agree that this is possible? We could just focus on the negative commandments right now. thing of
Can anybody else hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay.
Here, Robert,
Bryce,
I think
take over.
Robert.
He's frozen.
I think it's just
the frozen chosen.
Bryce, take over, Bryce.
it's Robert.
Isn't that funny?
I don't know if
I wonder if he knows. He may be talking for about 10 minutes here.
Oh, we
he's
lost him.
gone. He knows.
Yeah.
He got kicked out.
Yep. Well,
Well, I guess it's still recording.
Yep.
Yeah, which is interesting.
Made you the host.
I didn't know if, yeah, how that would work.
Oh, I'm the host now?
Yep. Yep. So don't click off too early.
So
Can
I
answer
guess
his question?
yeah, we might as well
you know,
answer the question, right?
Yeah. I mean, I can see some positive things. Here again, that may be a way to expand it. You know, you shall not steal could be share your wealth, share what you have. You know, make sure that others that are less fortunate, you know, that you can be a blessing to them. I mean, that's a good way to expand that. You know, you shall not commit adultery. Treasure your spouse and your family, and look at those vows as a opportunity to is to be free to do something rather than a way to be restricted from doing something else. So I think old Calvin may have been onto something.
Well, and if you look at it like really strictly, I can probably go my whole life and say, I am not going to murder anybody. But,
Well, Rick's pretty happy about that.
well, it's not over yet, but I'm just thinking.
There are those that might encourage her. So,
But I mean, you know, if it's just flat out murder, that's pretty easy to not break that commandment. But when you expand that to other things, then, you know, I can pretty easily just fail right off the bat. So I would think God would want to hold us to a higher accountability that other than just don't kill somebody.
Yeah.
Hi, Robert.
Hey, sorry, the elves were not wanting me to join Bible study.
I think looking at this through those lenses, I think it's a really great perspective, because I think what Paige said is right. And I was joking with my middle schoolers about this as well. You know, it's really easy not to kill somebody. And then even some of the other commandments, you know, thou shalt not make an idol. Those, you know, even that at first glance is easy to follow, and maybe it's less easy when you start thinking about the things that we do make idols, even if it's not a physical idol. But then I think you can look at those in that same sort of view that Calvin was talking about. And I guess thou shalt not have an idol. It's almost like you should be putting God first and what God's calling you to do first. And that, I think, takes on new life of its own.
I'm glad you spoke on that, Bryce. That one I was kind of struggling. I was like, how do we make that one live? So we did, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit idols.
You know, I was going to say, you shall not bear false witness. Take the opportunity to build up your neighbor. I mean, that's a positive spin of, rather than bearing false witness, it would be, take the opportunity to build your community and even those you don't know.
I think that's a really important one these days.
As divisive as this world has gotten, that whole concept seems to be missing.
Mm-hmm. A lot of the Reformed or the Reformation theologians and I mean, a lot of theologians in general, even the early ones, sort of struggle to do, what do we do with the law now that the law has been fulfilled? And a lot of what they kind of came to is sometimes like buoys in, when you're sailing, is they're sort of guideposts. And then someone said sort of it's curriculum or code, clear instructions on the new life in freedom with Jesus Christ, so we don't throw them away. And I think especially with turning these into positives, as you have sort of, as David, you said, and as Paige and Bryce have said, that what I was able to hear, if you also contributed what you said, really kind of helps, turning it into a positive really helps kind of do that as more of a, what are we charged to with, instead of just restrictions of clear, just, no's. And I feel like it makes it more expansive as well.
So the commandment about the Sabbath, I feel like should just be erased the way we are today. And I mean, especially, church of all things, y'all work the hardest on Sunday as any other day. And, for the benefit of the rest of us, but you can hardly be expected to follow that commandment when you're leading a bus on Sunday.
That's why we take Sabbath on a different day. I mean, I think that's where it goes back to, I think as David said, the spirit versus the letter of the law is, and a lot of stuff talk in seminary, and I'm in a sort of new ordained pastors group, and a lot of it is to help us make sure we don't burn out. And they're like, make sure you find a time to make your Sabbath. And that's not, I mean, it definitely helps to have, I get Fridays off since I'm working on Sundays, but it's not just sort of a day off, but like, what are you doing that connects you to God and really gives you that shalom or that peace, something that's restorative, and making sure that we incorporate in that. But I think that can be applied to a lot of people. And the young adults group talked about this, and I think Carson, actually, we were talking about struggling, is to making sure we're finding time for Sabbath. Even in the Jewish calendar, there's a lot of rhythms and it's repetitions. There's 6 years, and on the 7th year is a year of Jubilee, and it's forgiveness. And then there's the 70 years of Jubilee, and then there's the 7th century. I mean, it's a whole repetition. So can you even find Sabbath in your everyday? And a lot of people have that as a daily devotional or time for prayer. We were talking about it's difficult to find it during a whole day in the week, especially the way we live now, especially right now when we're all virtual and we're all at home and we're all available. So why not answer that email? So that Sabbath is important, but the priests were working on Sunday with Moses, so they figured out a Sabbath. But I would love to ask just one more question, throw it out to the group. And these are two kind of modern ones we can do is, what does it mean not to here's one question. What does it mean not to make wrongful use of the name of the Lord? How do we uphold that today? Or what are some ways, constitutes an idol for you personally, or even in the Presbyterian Church? Just throwing those two out there. We could say committees.
Well, I mean, we have so many idols that, Presbyterians with the hard work ethic and that type of thing, your house, your car, half the time your children or your spouse, or there's just so many things that without even going out and making a, graven image that you're doing deliberately, but I at least, it's just so many things that I'm putting ahead of where they really should be.
Yeah. I feel like concepts and ideas are almost more of an idol. We're more likely to fall into that idolatry than a pagan god, I would say.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, some Christians, and I'm sure they're thinking we're pagans, but anyways, we'll cut that one from the recording.
Yeah. Those people are confused anyway, so.
Bless. Anyone else, sort of your understanding of idolatry, what you...
I think there's some people that would say, look at your calendar and look at your checkbook, and where you spend your time and money is what you idolize. And
I totally know.
Yeah, and so you got this whole thing about how much of that is given up to God.
Yeah. No.
I guess it would be anything that takes your eyes off of God and you're heading in another direction. And if you feel like you're moving away, that's probably an idol for you. And to kind of always be checking yourself to see if something's pulling you away from God. So it could be anything.
Yeah. I think
for me, I sort of think of it sometimes to try to take some time each day or each evening to think about what happened during the day, or how I used my time that took me away from thinking about or recognizing that I have a lot to be thankful for, and have everything I need, have in my life what really matters is for me in terms of family and love and friends and faith and stuff. So whenever I've realized that there's things that I've either chosen to do or have taken me away from remaining, thankful and having that in the front of my mind, that becomes sort of an idol for me. And guess it's sort of like that passage about where your treasure is, there your heart is also, kind of thing.
For some reason, a very concrete thing came to my mind. You want an image, you say, okay, is there some great image that we focus on and focus on with intent over the day, many hours? And I'd say it's screens. So just like our Zoom screen right now, our television screens, of course, and I think we have to, maybe that's a warning there, not to let the television screens take over your life. I plan on continuing to use screens, but it was funny that it just occurred to me that is something we focus on a lot.
As we discuss it via screen.
That's right.
Right.
I find it in the screens it's the distraction of just, from whatever there is, but it doesn't allow me to listen usually. But here we're using screens to listen. And
Okay.
so, as the millennial. No. Well, thank y'all very much. I want to be respectful of our time. We will be back next week at 7 via Zoom with the Covenant of David. So 2 Samuel 7 verses 1 through 12. Natalie will be teaching us because I'll be preaching on it, so y'all don't need to hear me twice. But thank you for coming, and we'll talk soon.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody. Good to see you.